Okay, I'll just start off by basically what we're talking about is OpenAPI, sort of how it can relate to FileMaker Claris development, and why should you care? And there's really, to be honest, there's really only two reasons why you would care, which I'll get to. But when I found out about them, I thought they were quite compelling and really, really interesting. So I'll just introduce myself. Originally, I grew up in Canada, live in central London at the moment. Been working with FileMaker since the mid-90s. I started a company, Transforming Digital, a couple of years ago. And what we're looking at is using machine learning to extract insights from meetings. And I'm overly fond of German cars. So the extracting insights from meetings basically is how I got interested in this, that we're using Fast API in Python to do most of the back-end coding for the machine learning, or rather to provide the API part of the machine learning stuff. And I'm using FileMaker to basically mock up the interface because that's pretty straightforward. So then kind of the question was sort of, how can this easily talk? And I sort of, when I found out that Fast API modules supported OpenAPI the standard, I initially didn't really understand what that meant. So what you're going to get here is kind of basically a description of my learning journey. That I found there were a number of sort of issues I ran into on the way that I'll basically mention to you. So if you go down that journey, you can avoid them and save you several hours of head scratching late at night, hopefully. Anyway, so I'll just get into it. So basically, yeah, so we're going to cover what's OpenAPI, why should I care, what can it do, so how it fits in with software tooling, which is one of the kind of the key areas where it works, and then how will it fit with the Claris ecosystem. So the first question is, why is a standard for APIs useful in the first place? Basically, there's a number of reasons that you can have developers can understand code more quickly, both internally within the company producing the APIs because they've got guidance as to what their APIs should look like, but also as a consumer of APIs. If you just imagine, say for example, if Twilio did not use standards on their APIs, every different API would be written in a way that the guy who wrote it thought made sense, which would mean you as a consumer of the APIs would be struggling to get your head around how does this one work versus how does that one work, and so forth, all within the same company, when you would expect they should work in the same way. So the standards can help enforce consistency. It allows a test-driven approach to development, which is really, really key for, again, both the producer of the API, but also for the consumer of the API. And that's one of the things that OpenAPI will allow. It will allow an approach that includes test-driven development because it's so standardized. And software tooling. Software tooling, essentially what it means is that with the standard's written in such a way that you can have code that can write code. You've probably seen this with Postman, for example. If you connect to an API, Postman can tell you what the JavaScript code or the Python code or the curl code to talk to this API would look like. And that, in large part, is sort of aided by OpenAPI. One of the other things that software tooling helps is it means that you can write API code without talking to a live server. So that means that, say, for example, if we wanted to connect to, well, say Twilio, we don't want to debug our code talking to the live Twilio server because God knows what's going to happen. We could end up sending loads of emails to the wrong people. Any number of bad things can happen. But you're able to write your code, debug your API consumer without talking to the live server at the endpoint, which is actually the part that I thought was really cool. So basically, going back a bit, API programming interface, I'm sure you all know, but it's a set of functions and procedures that allow two programs to talk to one another, and it's a point of contact between two systems. and it's talking about the interface, and that's usually now sort of over HTTP, or a RESTful approach these days. So OpenAPI is a standard for describing APIs in a vendor-neutral way. You may have heard of Swagger. Initially, I thought that Swagger and OpenAPI were the same thing, but OpenAPI developed out of Swagger. Swagger is a slightly older standard for API documentation. They're very, very similar. They're both JSON-based. They're very similar because OpenAPI developed out of this. So, but there are differences. So initially, I thought they were the same. But so anyway, I've been focusing on OpenAPI in this talk. So fundamentally, it describes what the specification, what operations are supported by the API, what those operations mean. It describes the data format that's expected and what's going to be returned from the operation. It can be written in either JSON or YAML. And in this case, I'm going to be focusing solely on the JSON for fairly obvious reasons, because FileMaker can consume JSON, whereas FileMaker can't natively consume YAML. So because it can natively consume JSON, it just seemed like the logical of the two to work with. So now this is the really boring bit of the talk, because we're going to look at a little bit, some of the details of the specification. So basically you've got a JSON object, and the JSON root object supports an OpenAPI object, info. Not all of these matter for the context of what we're going to do, so I'm going to skip over some of them, and I'm just going to focus on only the ones that were actually relevant to what I was trying to do. So we're going to look at OpenAPI, the info, servers, paths, components, and security to a limited extent. Security primarily because that really, really messed me up in my testing, that I kept trying to test things and just getting not authorized errors. I think, how can they get not authorized errors? Like, I'm not talking to a live server, but because the standard supports security, you can very easily run into security issues while testing. So I'll talk about that and how I got around that a bit later. But that was actually probably the biggest issue I had in the whole thing. So that was several hours of head scratching, probably because I didn't really fully understand what I was doing. But anyway, so we'll just go through those ones. Yeah. So the OpenAPI element is required. It's a string, and basically it's the version number of the OpenAPI standard that is being applied, and it is not the same thing as the version number of the API you're talking to. So those are two separate things. We've got a version of the standard, and we've also got a version of the API you're talking to, we're looking at. So the info object, the only required element is a title. Everything else is optional. And you'll find actually that those are the only two required elements in the whole standard. So what we've got a summary, sort of a description of the service. You can have terms of service, contact information, license information, and then the version, and this is the one referring to the version of the API as opposed to the standard. You can return a list of servers. Now, not all APIs will give you a list of servers, but some of them will. I think the US Patent and Trademark Office API returns a list of which servers it supports, but also which, whether it supports HTTP or HTTPS. But most of the ones and examples I'll show you don't actually have anything in servers. But you can have multiple servers listed, sort of, development server, staging, production, so forth. And again, because this is all expressed in JSON, you guys can probably already guess where I'm heading with this towards the end of it. But and then we've got paths. So paths is actually basically where we're describing what is the path to the and then the methods that are supported. description, but also what responses it provides. And so you can see what responses it describes and what format, and it makes reference here to a schema. So the standard also supports data schemas. It's not mandatory, but again, it can support a schema. So in this case, we've only got just a get method, but if there was a post method or a delete method or the other 14 or 13 or whatever the number is, they would also have entries here nested below the pets. So the example I've used here is, it's kind of a standard demo one. It's called Pet Store. So the people at Swagger built to persuade people to use it, they built a sample document describing an API quite fully, and they used an example of a pet store. So the people at OpenAPI basically said they just converted that same one to OpenAPI. And there's a couple of different versions. There's some that are more fully featured than others, and others that are a little bit simplified, but kind of pet store is a standard one you'll see again and again here. We've got components, which basically, components is made up a whole load of things. So we've got schemas, responses, parameters. What's kind of cool is the standard can support examples. So when somebody basically codes their API, they can build in example data. So that example data can be used in the testing without needing to talk to a database. So that's kind of cool, I thought. Request bodies, headers, security schemes, links, so all this other stuff. So you can see here in the case we've got schemas, we've got sort of a general error and a category, and the general error is describing what it is, what properties it's got. So you can see we've got an error code, which is an integer. We've got the message, which is a string, and same thing in terms of the category. It's an object. It's integer with a string. So, sorry, this is, like I said, the boring part. Yeah, so under components, we've got schemas. This basically, defining our input and output types. Yeah, and that's, again, those same examples. And then we've got the responses that are defined. So in this case, you can see we've got a code 200, description, it's a pet to be returned. And then it's referring to the schema under the components. And then we've got the default response. The default response in this case basically is an error message if it's not returned anything correctly. And then we've got parameters. So parameters might be anywhere in the path, in the query, the header, or cookie. And then we come to security schemes. So in this case, you can see we've got security schemes, we've got sort of pet for auth, and they're saying this type it's OAuth 2. And I'll be quite honest, I've not worked my head entirely around how all this part of it works. Basically, yeah, this I found this I found the most problematic part of the whole thing of communicating with OpenAPI. The other approach we had was we've sort of got two security schemes, the OAuth, but also we've got an API key approach, where we've got an API key in the name, and that's in the header. So yeah, this is getting a little bit boring. So an API server can self-document with this. So if I just do this, I did tell Johan that I was going to do a little bit of live demo, but it's all running off this computer. So, so this is this is talking to a server I've got running locally. These are the methods it supports. It supports a get method. And if I say try it out, then execute, basically it shows me the curl equivalent. Down here it shows me the response. Basically getting a hello world down here, and then shows me the response headers. Now the really, really cool thing is that basically I wrote this in Fast API in Python, and I did not write a line of code to do this. This Fast API built this all for me, and it supported it out of the box, which I thought was super cool. Yeah, I just was, when I first saw that, it's like, wow, that's, so I mean, yeah, my code, basically the code to do this, all I did was basically, I just wrote the method to return a Python object that said hello world, and Fast API took care of everything else. Building all that supported, which, yeah, I thought was just amazing. So I'll come back to that in a bit. So why would we mock a server? Who would want to make fun of a server? Well, it solves one of the annoying problems that we've got when we're trying to develop code that's talking to APIs. What we can do is, given a document that describes the API standard, we can run our own mock server, we can query that server, and it responds as the live server would, without us talking to the live server. So basically, I can write all kinds of buggy code trying stuff out, and if it breaks, it doesn't matter, because it's only talking to my server that doesn't actually touch any real data. It's not going to send an email, it's not going to do anything. It's just going to respond according to the standard. So basically, mock server is a fake server. It emulates a real server. It loads the spec and runs a web server, so you can work with an API before you write it. Actually, that's the other thing. So just the two sides. As a consumer of an API, which is probably what most of you are looking at, it enables you to do what I've just described. But if you're writing an API, you can actually write the API standard document in JSON before you ever write a line of code to serve that API, run it on a mock server, and your development team that's going to consume the API, they can start writing code and testing before you've ever written a line of code to actually serve anything. It also means that basically they can feedback on it enables a much quicker, more iterative approach to developing an API, that the consumers can feedback saying, I like this, I don't like that. So it's really, really cool. The other neat thing is that it can generate random sample data, because it's got a specification. It knows what kind of data it should be returning from the schemas. So basically, it can generate a string. I mean, it's basically random. It's random strings or random numbers, unless you've written the examples. But you can do that as well. But still, random text or random numbers coming back, as long as it can conform to the specification, that's good enough to develop and test. And that's kind of where it enables test-driven development. That you could write code that basically hits the server and you know what you expect to get back. You can test, am I getting back strings where I expect, and all that kind of stuff. Does this conform to the specification? So it's cool. So, okay, there's several different mock servers. Postman provides a mock server service in the cloud. So you have to sign up for an account and they'll run it in the cloud. What I've used something called Prism, which is a Node module. So basically, I've just installed it on my MacBook, and yeah, it's basically it will run a mock server on my computer. Oh, they also support Docker, of course. Yeah, so it's free. It's, I believe, open source. And it seems really straightforward to use. I was able to have it running in a couple of minutes once I worked out my Node permissions for installing it, but that's another issue. So this is kind of what the server looks like. Basically, when you run it, so the command on the command line, I just basically say prism mock, and then petstore.oas3.json is the name of the JSON file that has the standard. It basically then starts up, runs the server, and basically this is what it supports. basically you can hit these with curl, or, oops, sorry, I shouldn't keep hitting that, but yeah, for the demo, I'm not using curl, I'm using something called HTTPy, because it gives a nicer format to the JSON responses. We'll see that in a second. Yeah, so there's that. Prism can generate example data. It's quite straightforward. There's very few options. Basically, the option D for or dynamic generates random examples. When it runs, you can specify the host, whether it's going to run multi-process, also which port. So this is what HTTPy gave me when I issued a query. So basically, I tried to connect to the server, localhost port found 10/pet. So that's one of the URLs that was listed when it started running, except application JSON. And actually, HTTPy is quite nice because what it does is it returns all this very nicely for another. With curl, just basically give you a big line, which is much harder to read. Sorry about the blue text. I don't know how to change that. So you can see basically it's coming back saying unauthorized, and then it's saying, you know, headers, authenticate, OAuth 2, invalid security scheme used. Yeah, and this, yeah, I've got to confess, I spent hours looking at variations of this error, trying to work out, basically, because, anyway. And if I authenticate, which in this case, basically what I did was I just, in my request, I just passed in API : quote API key. It then returns states 200 okay, and gives me a JSON object saying, you know, category dogs, you know, we've got a doggy, you know, is available, basic data formatted as the specification described. Yeah, so HTTPy is what I used to do the querying. It's basically, presuming almost everyone here is on a Mac, and it's basically, it's a brew module, so you can brew install HTTPy, and it will install that. Postman, obviously, will work with this as well. And what you can do, it's quite simple. Postman has an import command. If you import, you can import an OpenAPI spec document, and it, in this case, you can see Swagger Pet Store 3. It basically will give you all the information, basically like that, as you expect. Very standard. You can generate code from it. So that's quite cool. And basically, so the OpenAPI spec document, you can usually, most companies or APIs that support it give you somewhere where you can download the document. They don't all host it live on a server because, but they almost all, because it's very helpful to developers. You see a lot of GitHub repos that have got that kind of stuff in it. Interestingly enough, what I realized while I was doing this is the FileMaker server data API gives you a link to download an OpenAPI spec document directly from the not the admin console, but the page for the data API, which I thought was kind of cool. Annoyingly enough, so basically what you can do is you can import that, and it will give you, generate all the commands you need to talk to the data API, if you should so wish. Annoyingly enough, the server admin API provides no such document, which is unfortunate because actually it was the one that I was much more interested in seeing a spec on, because the data API, we've probably all messed around with it enough that we've got a bit of an idea about what it does, whereas the server admin API, I've only poked at a few times in the distant past, so I really can't remember what any of the commands are. So it would have been really, really nice if that was the one that had the spec document. But it's not, so unfortunately. yeah, so, once I started this kind of trek down this path, I thought, actually, it'd be really cool if I just imported the spec document into FileMaker, and wouldn't it be cool if I imported the spec document, and FileMaker, I could write a script that would generate FileMaker code, basically generate the code to talk to a server that it had never seen before, just from importing the spec. I thought that'd be really cool. So anyway, what I've got is a very, very ropey, very early proof of concept kind of instance of this that that sort of works sometimes, and I noticed a couple of bugs. Come on, you guys all know what like an early proof of concept is like. However, the night before last, I actually did import a spec, hit the button saying try it out, and it basically queried the server without writing any code specific to that API. It just basically all from the spec. So I thought that was, I was really happy when I made that work. What I've since found is that, yeah, you will want to write your own code if you're dealing with an API. But what it does do is it provides a starting point, like of getting that initial talking to the server. Again, I've got to confess that I'm still the authentication side of it. My demo file doesn't yet properly deal with authentication, and I'm only at the moment processing one parameter. But it is an early proof of concept, and anyway. So yeah, so what I'm doing is I'm importing the JSON file, parsing it, basically breaking it out into, I'm not dealing with all of the objects. At the moment, I think I'm grabbing everything from the info object. I'm grabbing the paths. There's a little bit of a bug about in that it's kind of generating one extra path at the end, but that's like just an off by one error somewhere in my thing. Yeah, anyway, calls the API endpoints, retrieves without coding specifically for them. So I thought that was kind of neat. I'm sort of almost at the end of the slide part, but what I'll do is I'll show you a quick demo in HTTP, but also the FileMaker file. So in terms of benefits for the developer, it allows us to debug API code without talking to the live server, which I think is a really big thing. That's really, really handy, I think. Enabling software tooling helps with example code, and we end up with more consistent APIs that developers can learn faster. Yeah, so those are kind of my three big points. So I know that it's sort of frowned upon, but we're going to do like a little live demo, if that's okay, Joris and Johan. Okay. So what I'll do is, first off, I'll just really quickly show you. So this is, oh, hold on. Interesting. No, that's my Python IDE. Well, it's running, so I'm just going to leave it and we won't poke that. So you can see here, I basically bumped up the text size to like 20 points. So can everyone read that in the back? Yeah. Just about. Yeah, so that's that's Prism running, and in this case you can see we've got sort of the with the D, so the D option will generate random data. So if I yeah, so I'm just gonna query that, and what that's done is that's returned. So the query was against the pets by category, and Yeah, you can see that essentially what's done is it generated a bunch of random text, words that fit, but they all meet the spec. So for the purposes of testing an API, writing code, that's good enough. Because we're not testing the database connection here. We're just looking at just the API side of it. So it's good enough for that part of it. And if I ran that without the API key, then I basically get this error. So fundamentally, the way I worked around this was by cheating. I imported the spec into Postman, then I looked at what curl was sending, copied that when curl authenticated, copied its authentication that worked, because curl managed to work out what it needed. If I spent a lot more time, I'm sure I could have, but that's not really what I was after. So I just copied what curl did and then used that as my authentication header, and that worked. And so yeah, so we can just grab. So if we look at any other commands, one second. Grab that stuff as well. And then, yeah, we just got like a one. So the inventory just returned just the one item. So anyway, yeah, you can test out with curl, Postman, whatever. And in this case, when I started the server here, I just made reference to the JSON file. So I think. Yeah, I've just got the JSON file sitting somewhere in here. Okay, now the FileMaker file. So you can see we've got basically here we've got the. I've just got a bunch of different APIs that I've imported. Where's the yeah, the Twilio API, their document is enormous and it's very complex. I should say that this example file I've done works with relatively simple files. I've not done anything about doing links within, relative links within JSON documents. Twilio basically seems to be a maze of references to other JSON documents. And to be honest, I looked at that and I thought, I'm not going to be able to make that work. So it's a simpler version. The FileMaker server data API I've imported. And so you can see it doesn't list any servers, but in terms of paths, this is all the stuff that it imports. And basically more information. I've not parsed all the way down to the bottoms of those paths. Primarily, my main interest was what's the minimum thing I can do to actually get to the point where I could issue a query against the test API and have it work. And so in this case, so if I come up here, here's my local API server for Malmo. That's the URL. So if I opened that in a browser, you'll see we get the JSON back. So if we've got our JSON document, so I'll just clear everything. So that's cleared all the data. If I say update, that simply goes through, parses the document, into the paths, and then I can actually, if I go to, like I say, proof of concept, so very, very messy. Please forgive that. But so if I click on try it out, you can see returned hello world. So that basically queried my mock server, but I didn't write the code. Essentially, we're basically working out what needs to be done here. So we've got ones that have got parameters. So if I say try it out, this has got a parameter. So it returns hello Malmo. And if I say list, try it out, that's talked to my local dev server, which has queried Amazon Web Services to get a list of SQS queues that I've got on my Amazon account. So now clearly with this, I basically would want to write specific code for that. However, what it's done is it's written code that actually got me far enough that it was able to query Amazon without me writing code specifically to talk to Amazon, based solely off the specification. Actually, okay, sorry. Let me rephrase that. I should say, what I'm actually doing here is the code talking to Amazon is basically in my, sorry, clarify this because it's qualified, is actually, I've written that code in Python, so that code is pre-existing, but the API that I've got talking to that, so this is talking to my API, which is running my pre-existing Python code for talking to Amazon. So I'm not talking directly to Amazon from FileMaker. Sorry, that probably is a bad example because it's probably confused everyone now. But yeah, so like I say, it's a really early proof of concept file. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to tidy up a couple of the bugs, and then I can stick it up on the stick it up with the presentation if anyone's interested in it. So does anyone have any questions? Sort of that kind of covers it sort of from the presentation side of things. So any questions or thoughts?
So FileMaker has its own OpenAPI documentation.
They do for the data API, and I cannot remember what the URL. I remember thinking when I went to bed last night, oh, I should check what that API, what the URL is for that. But if you connect to the server admin console, I think that if you connect to the page for
isn't it /docs/
that'll probably
It's already on the server, so it's
on your server, and
so everyone is who's going to install FileMaker server will have it on their server. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So you can either copy the file off the server, and then look at it from there. I'll confess I've not actually tried running that in a mock server, but if it's a standard, if it complies to the standard, there's no reason it wouldn't work. So yeah. So I'm sorry, it's a little bit short of the 1 hour, but so if any yeah, Fabrice.
Well, first it's quite fascinating. Your approach is so promising. What in short would be your the reason bottleneck, your challenges at the time?
I'll be quite honest that the challenge that prompted me to do that was it's kind of one of those things that as I was looking at OpenAPI with reference to the other stuff that I was doing kind of in Python, I thought, actually, this is JSON. Yeah, so, I mean, FileMaker talks JSON. So, and then I thought, actually, in the same way that Postman can generate code to talk to this, would it be possible for FileMaker to generate?
Where are you now with the project? You seem to be saying that there's still a lot to do.
Oh, on this? Yeah, this essentially where this stands at the moment is that what you see here is kind of pretty much it. That those tabs, that we've got sort of, it parses the info object, it parses the paths object, it's starting to parse the components object, and sort of script-wise, it's very, very basic so far. So what I've done is I've actually used a lot of auto-enter calcs in the thing, just basically sticking chunks of JSON in and having things populating through auto-enter calcs. And then I've got one script that kind of loops through the objects to set the servers. And
Now you rephrase them. What kind of help do you need to achieve this? Because it's really very
got you. I'll be quite honest, I'm not certain. Actually, I've not thought that far ahead. The last couple of days I've been kind of thinking of like how getting this ready to show anyone. I've got some straightforward, simple bugs that I want to get tidied up, and then I think the next thing I want to do is get the basics of parsing out the schemas. And at that point, then I'll probably have a much better idea what next steps look like. So.
And just another one, sorry.
Yeah.
What are the big differences between Swagger and OpenAPI? You said in the introduction it was very similar. I still see a lot of documentation in Swagger, so.
I'll be honest, I'm not looked in depth into that. It looks like it looks like it's. I suspect a lot of it's differences. It looks like the kind of thing that might be differences of opinion between developers on what's the best way to phrase something. I mean, it's broadly speaking, they're very, very similar. They've got.
Do you think your system?
Could it be adapted to work with Swagger? Oh, I don't see why not. Because fundamentally, they're doing the same thing with different path names or phrasing and terminology. So yeah, I would expect there'd be no issues with doing that. So, yes?
Yeah, my question is basically on the same line as Fabrice. It's like, was this just a proof of concept and like an exercise for you, or are you going to take this further and maybe build an add-on out of it? Maybe helpful.
To be honest, I was thinking sort of proof of concept, but actually, kind of as I got more into it, then I'm not certain on that yet. That is the honest answer. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So that sort of is that basically is it. So unless there's any other questions, thanks very much for coming and listening to me.